No, we're good. We're good.
Yeah.
So specifically, it's Rule 702. Thank you. You're welcome.
All of the mics are still muted just in case they start. Let me.
Turn everything back on.
They're on. My apologies.
I think she's my age, so I do that.
All rise.
Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the presence of the jurors, counsel, as well as the parties. And we do have Dr. Wilson on the line. Counsel, you may continue with direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I don't see Dr. Wilson yet.
Nope, it looks like she got disconnected.
She was there just a moment ago before I stood up.
Yeah, no, she's must have disconnected.
Dr. Wilson, are you able to hear us and see us?
Yes, I am, after accidentally disconnecting.
Well, the commissioner was about to fess up that she did it when she stood up.
I did the same thing, doctor.
Okay. I was just trying to get rid of a little pop-up that I thought was an ad.
We'll let the two of you duke it out. Okay, so. All right, so we were talking at the time that we left about the suicidal feelings and the depression that Gary Johansson had experienced as part of his medical records. And you were commenting that it's often a precursor to some other mental health issues. I don't know if you mentioned Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or what, but if you could kind of pick up from there and comment on what it's a precursor to.
Sure. Depression can be a precursor to Parkinson's, but it is a known precursor, not a risk factor, but an actual early example or manifestation of Lewy body dementia. Sometimes it's a person develops a psychosis late in life, and that can lead to a diagnosis of Lewy body, but it's increasingly recognized that severe intractable depression also can be the early sign of, the very early sign of Lewy body dementia.
In evaluating Gary Johansson and looking over his medical records, did you see that kind of severe intractable depression that would evidence something leaning towards Lewy body's dementia?
Well, if somebody had appeared with just the depression, that's not what you're not going to diagnose Lewy body. But now we know, looking back, when you see the very first hints of Parkinsonian symptoms or dream and hallucination issues, what have you, you look back and you see that there's been this deep depression for a number of years, sometimes 10 or more years before the person's gotten to a point where anybody even has a reason to think Lewy body. So now we know that that can be the first sign of developing Lewy body dementia.
And did you notice in his medical records any documentation about dreams, dream enactment, or hallucinations?
Yeah, it was inconsistent. I mean, as is often the case, people either misinterpret the dream symptoms or they're embarrassed by them and they deny them, but then they let it slip out. And so by the time Mr. Johansson was seeing the psychiatrist that he saw, I think in 2016, he was saying, well, the only time I've ever had problems with hallucinations or wild dreams is, when I was in the hospital. And he certainly did at those times. But in fact, he told Dr. Ettling in 2015 that he'd had those kinds of problems for some while. And in that case, it took the form of pretty wild visual hallucinations shortly before falling asleep or shortly after waking up. And we know now that if that happens occasionally, once or twice, it's not a big deal. But if it happens routinely, that's another sign that we may be seeing the development of Lewy body dementia, because it's pretty unique to that. So, and by the time I saw him, he was having frank hallucinations all over the place. So yes, there were hallucinations, there were dream enactment behavior, which is when a person acts like they're awake during a dream, or they lash out, their body does not fully relax the way it normally does during dreams. Sometimes we'll carry a dream over into the next day, and it's hard for them to get out of that dream state, which is called onirism. And, those sorts of peculiar dream-related behaviors or hallucinations are pretty classic Lewy body.
In terms of treatment of depression and suicidal feelings, what's kind of the consensus on how easy or difficult those are to treat?
It's always difficult. Not everybody responds to the same antidepressants. It's especially difficult late in life. And one of the things about a deep depression related to Parkinson's or to Lewy body is that it tends to be very difficult to treat. It doesn't improve well with antidepressants, for example, and people with Lewy body in particular have very bad reactions to many medications. Really bad reactions. And so what might be a normal dose of an antidepressant might throw somebody for a loop. to my understanding, it didn't appear that Gary was treated for quite a number of years until perhaps in the 2015, 2016 range. And then they tried him on a couple different antidepressants. At one point, he became extremely oversedated on a relatively low dose. And Donna, I think in this case wisely, cut the dose in half, and he did much better. But again, that's an example of the extreme sensitivity that Lewy body patients have to medications.
A person who suffers from serious depression or suicidal feelings, what is their ability to think clearly when suffering with that condition?
It's impaired. We know that anything effortful remembering, effortful concentration, basically anything that takes a little extra mental muscle is incredibly difficult for a severely depressed person. They not only don't feel like they can deal with it in a way cognitively, they really can't. Their ability to process at a normal speed slows down, which is also true of Lewy body dementia. Everything just seems sluggish and overwhelming. They become sometimes irrationally irritable, sometimes extremely passive. They don't make good decisions. They can't think things through, and they can't participate in any kind of effortful thought process.
What is the ability of a person suffering from depression or suicidal feelings in terms of problem-solving activities?
They're almost always impaired. They're impaired depression brings with it bad judgment. People make really bad decisions. They get divorced, they leave a job, they do whatever because the depression is defeating them, and they think it's the situation around them. So they make rash decisions, unwise decisions. Judgment is almost always adversely affected by severe depression.
So a person who's suffering with suicidal feelings and serious depression, is there any kind of tendency to pass on their decision-making to other people?
Well, it depends. And it's not necessarily consistent. On the one hand, anybody who's depressed or anxious, if someone says, I can take that burden off your shoulders, and it's someone that they have a predisposition to trust, they are much more prone to say, do it, take it over for me. That's great. But on the other hand, if someone says, here, bustles in and says, let me do this, they may react with anger because they're not thinking about the fact that they can't do it and they don't want to do it. They're feeling hypersensitive to feeling helpless or to having low self-esteem, and anything that wraps into their confidence is going to basically piss them off, if you would pardon the French.
Okay. Let's jump into Lewy body's dementia. We've heard that term used several times today, and I think you've even referred to it as diffuse Lewy body dementia. Can you please explain what Lewy body dementia is and how it might differ from, say, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or a regular kind of dementia?
Well, it is a regular kind of dementia. It is probably the second most common after Alzheimer's, but it is also one of the most underdiagnosed conditions because it can look like severe depression and slowing and just a little bit of dream problems and what have you. And we know it takes years for Parkinson's to be diagnosed properly in most cases. And Lewy body is the same way. It often takes years because memory is not obviously affected the way it is in Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's has a pretty predictable presentation and course. Maybe some variations, but you know what you're looking for, and when you see it, you know what you got, at least as a professional. Lewy body can come looking like depression or like psychosis. It can come looking like periods of confusion and clarity, It can come looking like early Parkinson's, and it takes a few years for all the pieces to fall into place. Therefore, the research to differentiate it in terms of how long does it take from diagnosis to the point of hospital or institutionalization or death, that kind of research is still ongoing because we tend to find these people later than we find someone with Alzheimer's. They may have been suffering every bit as long and been just as impaired, but it's not the obvious memory problem. I should also mention that about 30 to 50% of people with Lewy body dementia also have signs of Alzheimer's, and a very high percentage of people with Alzheimer's, on autopsy, we find that they had Lewy body, cellular level Lewy body damage as well. So how they interact and overlap is still being studied.
Thank you. So as you looked at the testing you did on Gary Johansson, and as you looked at his prior medical records, can you kind of give us an idea, a continuum of how his diagnosis progressed into where you believe it's Lewy body dementia?
Not having the 2012 and 2013 and subsequent neurology records, I don't know why he went to a neurologist in 2012, but he has said repeatedly, and his doctors have documented that he did. And that says to me that he was feeling subjectively that there were problems by that time. He'd been depressed for a long time by then. So this is my surmise based on looking at the medical records. Something was problematic enough that someone like Gary Johansson would go to a neurologist and say, what's going on? I don't know anything more than some element of Parkinson's symptoms were present. And I only know that because his later primary care doctor made reference to that Parkinson's had been mentioned somewhere in the neurology records that nobody seems to have been able to find. And Gary had family members with Parkinson's or Parkinson's-like conditions, so he may have felt like, uh-oh, and gone to the neurologist because he was afraid he was developing it. By 2014, early 2014, we know that his inability to organize his thinking, to focus and concentrate and keep track of things, which is, frankly, commonly said memory, but it's not. It's one subtype of memory, but it's not really memory, if that makes sense. It's more the ability to organize and concentrate and analyze and have insight. His self-management ability was obviously deteriorated by January of 2014. I think if he'd seen a neurologist or a neuropsychologist at that point, there may have been enough to be able to say this is starting to look like diffuse Lewy body dementia. As it was November 2015 before Dr. Etling put the pieces together with the cognitive testing and said the cognitive test profile, the symptoms he's been reporting all fit Lewy body dementia, and that's what's going on here.
And what month and year was that, if you recall?
That was November of 2015.
And that was Dr. Etling?
That was Dr. Etling.
And
I will mention that there were concerns by his primary care physician and his endocrinologist before that, but that was the first time that I'm aware that Lewy body dementia was mentioned as the probable cause.
And so you said in November 2015 it was mentioned as a probable cause. Was it a probable cause or a diagnosis, and is there a difference?
I think Dr. Etling felt that the best he could do is this is consistent with and it's possible diffuse Lewy body dementia. Neuropsychologists can diagnose. We do diagnose. We do it all the time. But you want to have a neurologist involved if you're looking at something where there's Parkinsonian signs, because it is so easy to miss Parkinson's disease, for example. So what Dr. Etling said was, so far everything we've got in the history and in the testing says this is Lewy body dementia. Would he go so far as to say he formally diagnosed it? I don't know. But I would say that was the first time that it was tentatively diagnosed as the cause of all the problems, the confusion and the disorganization.
Was there a point later in time after November 2015 where Dr. Etling or any other physician gave a formal diagnosis of Lewy body dementia?
Yes, he saw a psychiatrist at Banner Health at their, forget the name of it, Cleo Thomas, I think, that their Alzheimer's and dementia specialty program. He saw Dr. Peter Taylor, who, based on history, symptoms, what little testing he did at the time, diagnosed probable Lewy body dementia. And I should stress that probable is the highest level of confidence. Until someone is dead and you can look at slices of their brain, you're really not allowed to say absolutely for sure Lewy body or definitely Alzheimer's. The most you can say is probable Alzheimer's, or in this case, probable Lewy body dementia.
And again, what was that month and date, and who was the doctor who said probable Lewy body dementia, if you recall?
It was Dr. Peter Taylor, and it was in fall of 2016, and I want to say it was October of 2016.
Thank you. In terms of doing your evaluation, you mentioned at some point that you talked to Gary and Donna's CPA, their certified public accountant. What did you reach out to him for? What gave cause for you to contact him?
I normally try to reach out to people who have had regular contact, even if it's only once a year, but have had contact over a period of time with someone. And in a case like this, where financial ability is the question, a CPA is a great person to talk to usually, or often. And in this case, Warren Greenfield, I think his name was, had been the CPA for many years and had noticed that around 2014 or 2015, Gary was completely unable to organize his tax and financial materials, and that this was really different than earlier in their association, and that it got worse. And the first time that Donna was really present for the tax meetings was 2018, and he said that she was just completely out of her depth by that time.
Thank you. In terms of your observations of Donna's interactions with Gary, especially in helping him manage his medical regimen, what conclusions did you come to there, or what did you observe?
Well, I want to clarify. I did not observe them much together. I didn't observe them, I didn't interview them together. I spoke with them for a few minutes in the waiting room and told them I'd be seeing each of them individually. What I can tell you is that Donna looked up to Gary, and she told me that, he had always been the one who kept her safe, ran the show, made the decisions, and she could have input, but she usually didn't. And he made all the decisions, and she was quite comfortable with that. She admitted that she avoided conflict at any cost, and that as he became more confused and disorganized, he also became more irascible and rude and harsh with her. And so she would avoid trying to do anything that would stir him up or offend him. For example, he saw no problem with leaving their house unlocked for some workmen who would be completely unsupervised, and her wallet disappeared. And she said, and I knew that was a bad idea, but he said it was fine. So, he said it was fine, so I went along with it. And I think that was a really good example of how she probably handled most things where she knew what he was doing wasn't really good or sensible, but she wasn't going to stand up to him, and she wasn't going to cause problems.
Thank you. Your report mentions some November 2015 testing that was done, and I believe this would be by Dr. Etling, and the testing that he showed mentioned areas of very significant decline, including executive dysfunction, borderline verbal fluence, and severe problems in visual learning and memory, visual construction, visual planning and reasoning, and bilateral psychomotor speed and coordination. Those are a lot of really big words and words that I don't really understand well. Can you kind of comment especially on the executive decision-making and anything else that you think really stands out to you, Doctor?
Well, first, let's go from the end backwards, I guess. The psychomotor slowing means that doing things with his arms or hands was way, way slower than his age and education group normally performed. And that's an indication of that's typically a Parkinsonian kind of symptom, which we see in Lewy body dementia, that slowing. And it's also reflected then in the person's mental processing. Verbal fluency, for example, is, how many words can you come up with in the next minute that start with the letter T? Or how many fruits can you come up with? And so the question is, as fast as you can, you're going ruffling through your mental index cards. And he was very poor in that, partly because he was not able to move quickly in his own head. With Dr. Powell, he also wasn't able to keep track of what the job was. He kept throwing the wrong things in. So there was mental slowing. He wasn't able to draw a line between numbers like 1A, 2B, 3C. He simply was not able to keep track of, I go from number to letter. That is a self-management, an organization, and executive ability. Other executive abilities are insight, being able to say, you know what, my memory is bad and I can't manage my own diabetes, or I shouldn't drive. He had problems, I think, with impulse control in terms of his temper. He had people with executive problems have difficulty thinking things through, thinking if I do that, then this or this could happen. I want that to happen, so I should do this. That kind of problem solving, looking ahead and seeing cause and effect is affected. The ability to make simple analytical things like this is similar to that because, a banana and an orange are both fruit, as opposed to, well, a banana and an orange, you eat them both. I mean, you think at a conceptual level. So he was impaired in all of those areas very significantly. And I mean impaired, not just below normal, by November of 2015.
And did you see anything in his medical records that showed any kind of improvement in those conditions after November 2015?
I did not.
And is there typically improvement when these kinds of conditions come on?
You can see some fluctuations in attention, and people with Lewy body dementia are particularly known for fluctuations, but it's not like they come back to normal so much as some days they may be able to focus a little bit better, but it doesn't mean that they're able to do any kind of clock drawing or visual or spatial things. And some days they may be almost incoherent or lethargic. Their arousal varies tremendously. But in terms of a true return to normal functioning, not if they're properly diagnosed, no.
I think I've heard you say that, or kind of a summation is that Lewy body dementia is something that's difficult to diagnose, and it's diagnosed over a period of time. Is that a fair assessment of what you said?
Yes, it shouldn't be as hard. It's terribly underdiagnosed. We know from autopsies that about 15 to 20% or more of people who are, quote, demented actually had Lewy body dementia, but only about 5 to 7% of people who have dementia get the Lewy body diagnosis. So we're missing more than half of the people who have Lewy body. And that's partly because it can look like depression, it can look a little Parkinsonian, it can look a little confused and forgetful. You have to be in a position to put all those pieces together and see that we've got a pattern here that doesn't fit anything else. That's what Dr. Etling did. That's what Dr. Powell did. And by the time he got to me, he could have had Alzheimer's. His memory was poor enough, but everything else was so much worse that it was consistent with Lewy body.
So if it takes that length of time for neurologists and neuropsychologists like yourself, very smart people, to figure this out, what's the possibility that a layperson, say like Donna Johansson, would understand what's going on with Gary Johansson's cognitive issues?
She would certainly know something was wrong. I wouldn't expect her in a million years to know that it was Lewy body dementia. I would not even expect many general practitioners to think of that, because that's, I mean, they think of Alzheimer's, that's what they think of. Alzheimer's or strokes. But they would know something is wrong. They would know that there is at least mild cognitive impairment. And again, that was documented as early as January of 2014. Mild cognitive impairment, whether it's Alzheimer's or stroke-related or Lewy body, means the person has concerns or complaints subjectively. They think something's not right. There is some kind of objective or observable problem, which was noted by his endocrinologist in 2014, early in 2014. And the person is affected in a way that some parts of their day-to-day functioning are not normal, that they need help. And in this case, he needed a lot of help with medical management. So he met the criteria for mild cognitive impairment by January 2014, in my opinion.
What is the chance that someone with Gary Johansson's type of issues could disguise those issues or cover them up or minimize them to people around him?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part of that.
What's the chance that people with Gary's type of issues, could he disguise or cover up those issues to people, family and friends around him?
Family and friends, I would hope, would see that something was not normal. It's true that people often can briefly pull together and put sort of a social veneer where they look sharper than they are, but that's partly because most of us don't like to make other people uncomfortable, and we fill in the gaps where we take over the conversation more than we realize. I don't think he would have been able to sustain any kind of superficial positive impression for more than a few minutes at a time. So I think anybody who dealt with him regularly would see the problems with insight, would see the problems with mental disorganization and forgetfulness.
What about persons that he has irregular contact with or limited contact with? Would they be able to see what's going on with him, or could that be disguised or covered over in any way?
I guess it depends on how irregular the contact. Someone who, saw him maybe once every few months for 15, 20 minutes might not be able to put together the trajectory of confusion, or might think, well, he's just having a bad day. Or they might just think, well, he's getting older. But anybody who saw him on any kind of a regular basis, weekly or what have you, I think would have to be aware that he was not functioning at a normal level. All
right. Looking at the party report that commented on Dr. Peter Taylor's October 6, 2016 findings or evaluation, can you please highlight there some of the issues that he raised, including reported memory problems, reported problems using the phone and the computer, and reported difficulty with familiar people or places?
note that some of this was Gary himself saying, I don't recognize people. I don't remember where I'm going. I don't recognize familiar places. That's pretty good. And some of that, no doubt, came from other sources. He couldn't use the phone. That's a significant level of impairment. He could no longer use his computer. That's a significant level of impairment. What we're seeing is that mild cognitive impairment from early 2014, by October of 2016, was flat out definite dementia. And he had been diagnosed, I think, by either the neurologist or maybe Dr. O'Coin with early dementia, even in 2015. So again, we've got a pretty clear trajectory that professionals were seeing the deterioration.
And can you also comment about Dr. Taylor's documented statements that Gary was suffering from inability or difficulty to recall events, and the fact that he scored 1790 on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment?
Well, those are slightly different things. I mean, his memory was clearly slipping and would have been much worse in situations that were either unfamiliar or that were not well organized for him. If he had to impose some kind of mental structure on what was going on, he was not going to remember it well. And that includes things like conversation, where you're not in charge of what the other person says or what tangent they go off on. That would be very hard for him to remember. He was forgetful. In terms of the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, it's just a screening test that looks at the ability to do certain really basic memory and executive and attention and language and a couple of visual spatial kinds of things. And a score of 17 on that is a score in the moderately impaired or moderately demented range. So that's clearly an indication of just how badly Gary had declined by that time.
And I also understand from your report that Dr. Taylor, in October 6 of 2016, diagnosed Gary with, quote, major neurocognitive disorder, parentheses, probable Lewy body dementia and behavioral disturbances, unquote. Did I read that correctly? Is that?
I believe you did.
All right. And then in regards to the word probable, I think you mentioned earlier, probable is the highest diagnosis we can give at that point.
The highest level of certainty, yes, until someone has died and their brain has been autopsied. I mean, frankly, in common parlance, we don't bother with it, but when you're someplace like a fancy Alzheimer's program that has research grants up and down the pike, you're going to pay attention to those kinds of details.
All right. And I think I also understand from your report, correct me if I'm wrong, that his diagnosis was then reconfirmed in December of 2016 and February 2017 with follow-up appointments he had with his physicians.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct. The diagnosis was never changed after that.
And was there any point in time where he was diagnosed as having advanced Alzheimer's, according to your report?
I think there was some place along the line where that was diagnosed, but it wasn't accurate. He never had anything that was consistent with a profile of Alzheimer's dementia. But I think the notion that it was severe, and then bracket the Alzheimer's, severe dementia, should stand out to us, because whether it was properly diagnosed as Lewy body or misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's, somebody at that point was seeing severe dementia.
And did you have a chance to review medical records for Gary Johansson from April 2017 from his nurse practitioner, Marina Reed?
Yes.
And what do you recall about, well, first of all, do you happen to know Marina Reed's, what she practices in, what area she's in?
Well, she is also at the Banner Dementia Program, and she took over for Dr. Taylor when he moved on to greener pastures. And so she was following with his patients who've been diagnosed. She would not herself typically be someone who would do the workup and make the diagnosis, but then for ongoing monitoring, once we know what's going on for management, she would have been quite capable. And that's essentially what she did, and to keep track of deterioration over time. But she was a nurse practitioner as opposed to psychiatrist or neurologist. And in that program, she could have been assigned to either neurology or psychiatry or both. They do have a few people who are doubly certified in psychiatry and neurology.
And do you know whether or not her records document anything in regard to Donna's ability or inability to stand up to Gary, and how much Donna understood what was really going on with him?
Well, she documented that even after he'd been diagnosed by multiple professionals with Lewy body dementia, Donna didn't believe he had it, because I'm sure Gary didn't believe he had it. And she wanted to know how it had been diagnosed, even though Dr. Taylor had spent over 45 minutes by his own records explaining it to her and to Gary. And she didn't believe that he couldn't drive, and she didn't believe that he couldn't handle the things that he said he could handle. And I think that documents that level of, I mean, you might call it denial, or you might call it codependency in this case. She needed him to be functional. She needed to be able to rely on him. He kept telling her she could, and so she did. And she would support him in his bad judgment. I mean, a man who cannot draw a clock or put a cross inside of a rectangle should not be on the road. And he couldn't do those things. But she felt that he wanted to. He said he could, so he could.
And then finally, on October 10, 2017, there were some medical records from neuropsychologist Jessica Powell. Did you have an opportunity to review those records as well?
Yes, I did, and I also reviewed her raw data.
All right. And in regards to her reporting, what stands out to you as significant in terms of Gary's mental capacity, executive functioning, and ability to function in day-to-day activities?
Well, part of what stood out to me is how much he had declined since 2015 in most areas. As I mentioned before, what also stood out to me is that she also did not use proper education corrections for some of the tests that require it. So I took her raw data and rescored it according to the proper norms for education. And he did even worse in some areas than, she thought he did bad. He did even worse than that. So that by the time she saw him, his language abilities were not low average. They were borderline abnormal. His comprehension of spoken language, she didn't test it per se, but she noted that he couldn't even follow pretty basic test instructions and needed to be re-instructed and still couldn't understand them, which is something that I also found. His verbal fluency, she put it at borderline to low average, but again, she neglected to mention that he had more false errors and more perseverations than he did correct answers, which puts that in a whole different light. His inability to discriminate what belongs and what doesn't. Perseveration is the inability to get rid of something when you're done with it in your head and move on to something new. But instead, he would keep repeating, let's say cat and cow, whether it was appropriate in that test or not. It would just keep popping up, sort of like things that pop up on your screen that you can't get rid of. And she didn't mention that, and she should have, because that is a sign of very significant cognitive impairment, and specifically executive impairment.
The perseveration?
Perseveration. That you only find that with executive dysfunction.
Okay, thank you for explaining that word. That was going to be my next question because it was beyond my pay grade.
Apparently beyond hers too.
What did you find significant about the testing you performed on Gary in terms of being a vulnerable adult or susceptible to undue influence? Now, this is in 2018, so I know this is after the fact, but
after the area and timeline in question.
Yes.
And he was, as I said before, on a mental status exam, he was in the bottom 1% of his age and education. He couldn't draw a clock if his life depended on it. His ability to name objects that you show him on a page, like a trellis, for example, or an accordion or a spear of asparagus, had declined to the point where when I saw him, he was in the mildly impaired range. His ability to understand test instructions really stood out to me. There's one test of language comprehension where a person reads a sentence that has a word missing, and their only job is to figure out a word that completes the sentence correctly. That, if it's supposed to be plural, it's plural. If it's past tense, it's past tense. Like the bus was full, there wasn't a single open blank on the bus. Obviously, the answer is seat or place. He could not comprehend what he was to do. I walked him through as many simple samples as I could, and he was unable to do it on his own at all. And that's something, quite honestly, that a second grader would be able to do in at least a simple form. He just couldn't do that. His executive abilities were abysmal. His ability to focus and concentrate were terrible, and he couldn't communicate. He could communicate pieces that sounded coherent, so you would say, well, that made sense, but he couldn't organize it with other pieces, so you ended up having a jumble of things that might be vaguely related, but darned if I could figure out how. And if I'd say, well, wait a minute, you said this, and then you said that, how are they related? He could not, for the life of him, either understand what I was asking or put the pieces together in a way that made sense.
thank you. So the testing you performed in 2018, plus going backwards in time to look at the medical records of his prior doctor's visits and neurologist visits and so forth, did that allow you to draw what you've referred to as a trajectory showing a persistent, steady decline or something of that nature in regards to his vulnerability and susceptibility to undue influence?
In terms of his cognitive abilities, yes. It let me draw a trajectory back to basically 2014, where he would have met the criteria for mild cognitive impairment had he, and he may have with his neurologist, we don't know because the records are missing, but he met the criteria that we use for mild cognitive impairment in 2014. By the end of 2015, he clearly had diagnosable mild to moderate dementia. By 2017, it was even worse. And by the time I saw him in 2018, he had severe dementia.
Thank you. You also had opportunity to test Mrs. Johansson in regards to vulnerability. And I think just the short answer to that can be that you did not find her to be a vulnerable adult at that time. Is that a fair summary?
It's true. Vulnerability under statute requires an impairment that affects the person's abilities. And she has no impairment when I saw her. Cognitively, she was broadly in the normal range from low normal to upper normal. Her conversation was very disorganized, but more in a tangential kind of, I've got too much to say, unlike her husband who couldn't put pieces together. So she essentially did not meet the criteria for a vulnerable adult at that time.
All right, and then did you also test her as to the possibility that she was susceptible to undue influence?
Well, that's the kind of thing that if a person doesn't have cognitive impairment, you're then looking, at least in part, at personality and personal style. Undue influence, unlike vulnerability, which means a person has an impairment, they are vulnerable to anybody. Undue influence can be very specific. You can be influenced by someone you trust, but not by the neighbor across the street. You can be influenced by a favorite child or family member, but not by your distant cousin. It is related to developing a degree of dependency and reliance and comfort on a person who then takes advantage of that dependency and reliance and trust. So it's a very specific thing. And a personality like Donna, who is not the most organized thinker in the world, who would let her husband drive when he was clearly impaired rather than try to argue him out of it, who got to the point at one point, although she denied it with me, there were records indicating she had considered separating from him and having him go into assisted living or other care because she just couldn't deal with trying to control him or his behaviors. She said that wasn't the case when we spoke, and it may have never reached that point, but her unwillingness to try to exercise any control indicated to me a very dependent person and someone who could be easily cowed and someone who needed support from some quarter.
How would the severity of Gary's issues impinge upon Donna Johansson's ability to help manage his issues, like his, taking his medicines or getting him to a doctor appointment or keeping him from driving?
It's sort of a truism or a common thread with neurology and neuropsychology that the caregivers who actually have it worse are Parkinson's and Parkinsonian type caregivers, people who are caring for someone who's mental slowing, but they still may have fairly good memory. So someone with Alzheimer's, quite honestly, you can start basically telling them white lies. They won't know the difference and they'll be more cooperative. Someone with Lewy body dementia or Parkinson's, you can't do that. They will remember enough that they will know you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes or you're trying to maneuver them, and they will get irritable and sometimes combative. So as a caregiver, that's one of the worst conditions you can face is Lewy body dementia. It's bewildering. People don't know nearly as much about it as they do about Alzheimer's. That would have stressed anybody out. And a person like Donna, who had always relied on Gary for everything, would have been at a complete loss. The notion, just the concept of I now take control was foreign to her and extremely uncomfortable to her. And she has explained to me that she turned to her neighbor, Nikki, as the source of comfort when Gary was no longer someone that she could reliably depend on. That would make her, in my opinion, more susceptible than most people to undue influence.
Thank you. And could you comment a little bit more from your report about the extent of her reliance upon Miss Castelli?
Again, that came from Donna, and essentially she told me that she liked Nikki right off the bat, and as Gary was beginning to deteriorate more visibly, even early on, within the first couple of months that she met Nikki, she would turn to Nikki because Nikki would say, "It's okay, we can handle whatever," or "I will support you, I'll back you up," or "we can figure out a way to deal with this." So she started getting some of the dependency needs and the support she needed, not from Gary, but from Nikki. And she essentially got to the point, according to what she told me, that she thought of Nikki as her daughter. She would contact Nikki for help before she would contact her son-in-law or son or her daughter-in-law or the doctors. She relied on Nikki for advice, and if Nikki told her things would be okay, she would relax. One of the things that I think people don't always realize, if you are anxious, and caregivers are always anxious, they can't help it. If you are anxious and someone says, "I can take the anxiety away," you will automatically, you cannot help yourself. You will begin to depend on that. The most powerful thing we have is to reduce someone's anxiety. And that was what was happening in the relationship that Donna developed with Nikki.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I'm going to now ask you for your ultimate opinion for which you were hired. The law requires that you give an opinion to a reasonable degree of neuropsychological certainty. If you cannot answer any of the following questions to a reasonable degree of neuropsychological certainty, please let me know, all right?
Sure.
So, doctor, in your opinion, was Gary Johansson a vulnerable adult?
At what point?
At the point starting in 2015, 16, or 17?
He was unquestionably a vulnerable adult, and a very vulnerable one in 2017. I believe he was clearly a vulnerable adult no later than November of 2015 when he saw Dr. Etling. But I also believe that Dr. O'Coin, for even a year prior to that, was talking about this guy needs to be in assisted living. In January, I think of 2015 or 2016, he actually contacted Gary's son to say somebody needs to do something. And he'd been doing that for some time. I think that it's entirely likely, to a high degree of neuropsychological confidence, that Gary Johansson was a vulnerable adult, probably from late 2014 on.
Thank you. And did he remain a vulnerable adult from that date, November of 2014, on through the date of his death?
Yes.
Thank you. So, for instance, that would mean he was a vulnerable adult on January 10 of 2017 when he signed over a check to the defendants for $127,000 in change. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true.
And that would mean that he was a vulnerable adult on or about March 30th, 2017, when he purportedly signed a quitclaim deed, supposedly transferring title to the 10124 West Ironwood property that defendants were renting at the time.
Yes.
And does that mean he was a vulnerable adult when he was paying quote unquote commissions to the defendants from August 2016 through mid 2017?
Yes.
And does that also mean he was a vulnerable adult from September 2015 through mid 2017 when the defendants were managing Gary and Donna's rental properties?
Yes.
And doctor, in your opinion, was Gary Johansson a person who was also susceptible to being unduly influenced?
By definition, someone who's vulnerable is susceptible to undue influence. But even prior to his vulnerability, yes, he would have been susceptible to undue influence absolutely no later than January of 2014 and probably before.
Thank you. And Dr. Wilson, did Gary Johansson remain susceptible to undue influence from the first date that you mentioned until he passed away?
Yes.
And doctor, in your opinion, was Donna Johansson a person who was susceptible to being unduly influenced at the time of the transactions that are complained of in this matter?
Yes.
And doctor, just again, what is the difference between vulnerability and undue influence?
One way to look at it is you're vulnerable because you have an impairment that prevents you from looking out for your own interests. So by definition, you are susceptible to being misled or defrauded or taken advantage of by anybody because it's your own cognitive impairment or physical impairment causing the problem. Undue influence can be very specific, and usually is, to just one or two people. You depend on someone, you become dependent on a neighbor, or you become dependent on one child, and they begin narrowing down who else can provide you support, or they are so reassuring that you feel you can unburden yourself to them. And that kind of relationship, if you've got someone who's not, say, financially savvy to begin with, can lead to undue influence.
Thank you.
That's a very specific relationship kind of exploitation.
And all these ultimate opinions you're giving to a neuropsychological certainty, a reasonable degree.
Yeah, I'll go beyond reasonable and say a high degree of neuropsychological confidence.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. And Your Honor, I'd like to move into admission exhibit number 88, please.
Any objection to the admission of Exhibit 88?
No.
88 is admitted.
And I know we're at the end of our day today.
Thank you for paying attention to the time.
If I may, Dr. Wilson, the opposing side will have the opportunity to cross-examine you, and so we will need you to appear tomorrow morning as well.
All right.
But we'll start with that cross-examination, I believe.
Yes, correct. Thank you, Doctor, for your presentation today. We will start tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you.
9:30 your time. Okay.
Our time, yes, Doctor. Thank you. You're excused for today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you for your time and attention here today. Have a good evening. We'll see you back here tomorrow. If you could meet in the jury assembly room, approximately 9:15, that'd be great. Have a great evening. Take care.
All rise.
Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the jurors are excused. We are in the presence of counsel as well as the parties. Thank you both for your presentation here today. We'll start back up tomorrow at 9:30. Is there anything additional for the record?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Have a good evening. Be safe going home. I'll have your time calculation for you in the morning. Take care now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, what a day.
Yeah, I know. It's a long day. These are all long days right now. So,
Bad day.
that's,
Okay, thank you.
I know, that was a hard one. I'm sorry.
I don't see any exhibits on anyone's tables. I think they're all important too.
Oh, yeah, I understand.
Except 88? Counsel, do you have exhibit 88?
I think I set it up here, Your Honor. It's 88. All these are together. Yes, here's 88.
Okay, great. We just want to make sure it just,
And then 89 is here as well.
all right, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sorry.
Okay. Good night.
Good night. Take care now. Okay, and please don't leave until we have the deputy.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Take me a moment for myself to go here.
Yay, thank you. How are you? Okay, are we all? You can go ahead and turn it on.